Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk about interdisciplinary studies, probably from my experience, but also talking about the future of where I see interdisciplinary studies going, and perhaps talking about one or two possible interdisciplinary studies that I'm starting to work on at the moment. My background is in education, so I come from a learning perspective. I'm interested in technologies and how they support learning and education. So it makes sense really for me as a researcher to be working with other people, because as I'm working in a field where I'm working with technologies, I'm interested in the uses of those technologies for education and learning, whereas other people are interested in things like the development of those technologies, which is something that I don't specifically look at. I'm not a technological developer, although actually quite a long time ago I did learn to program, so I was able to program in Fortran and COBOL. Whether I could do that now, I'm not sure, but I was able to. But I'm not a computing specialist, so it makes sense, for example, for me to work in an interdisciplinary way. So I'll try and open up this, because I've been working, if you like, in this idea of interdisciplinarity for quite a long time. I've been in research for quite a long time, so I've explored that through a number of studies. There are a number of different terms in this field, and I'll bring out three of them. Okay, one is interdisciplinarity, which is the term that is the title for today's research conversation. And then there are these other two, which are multidisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. And I don't really want to get into the distinction between these terms. I think what I will do is I'll use them fairly interchangeably today. But there is a distinction between them. If you want to explore that, then I think it can be worth it, because it does mean that there's a different way in which you're thinking about disciplinarity. So multi tends to be a number of, whereas trans is across, and inter is between or within. So it's a contextual, it's a conceptual sort of idea and change that's there, but I don't want to explore that in any detail. Okay. But what I would like to explore is that I do think there are different forms of interdisciplinarity. And what I'd like to do is to think about what I would consider as four different forms of interdisciplinarity. And this also makes a difference to the way that one looks at studies, at research studies. And I'll also talk about that from the point of view of one doing one's own research studies, particularly if one's doing it from the point of view of a master's research study or a doctoral research study or postdoctoral research study, because that actually the ways in which one can think about this are a bit different. So the first one I would say is subject interdisciplinarity. That's relatively straightforward, I think. Yeah, you can imagine subject interdisciplinarity. I would have different subjects. Methodological interdisciplinarity, and I'll come back to that because that's a really important one. I think actually that's much more important than subject interdisciplinarity, and it often arises from subject interdisciplinarity, but it's one that one has to be really aware of in terms of interdisciplinary research. The third is contextual interdisciplinarity, i.e. the context that one's working with and those that one is working with. And then there's what I would call cultural interdisciplinarity. So for me, there are four different forms of interdisciplinarity. In terms of subject, these are the main experiences that I've worked with. So I come from education. I'm coming at things from a learning perspective and from a teaching perspective. I've also worked with people from linguistics. Now, people in linguistics have a totally different view of the world from the world that I have. You know, they're looking very much at language itself, its structure of language, where it comes from, how it is used, etc. That's not the sort of perspective that I'm looking at from education. I'm looking at it from the point of view of how people learn language, if you like. I'm not looking at it from the point of view of the detail of language. So that adds a different perspective. I've worked with people in computing. As I've said, I'm not a developer. I'm not a technological developer. And therefore, if I'm providing evidence of how something is working or not working in education, it's useful to be able to use that, to be able to offer that to other people who can use it and then develop the technologies. So part of my role, if you like, from an educational point of view, is to identify what's working and what's not working, and give people within a computing field the opportunity to take that and develop it for education. So I work quite often with people in computing. I also work with people in management. Because in management, people are looking at things from a different perspective. You're looking at things there in terms of how you can manage things within an organization, within an institution, within a workspace, etc. And again, that's a different form of perspective. And then the last one is psychology. And actually, when I first went to Lancaster, I was in the Department of Psychology. I wasn't in the Department of Educational Research. I was in the Department of Psychology. So I was based there for actually quite a number of years. So I have experience of working with people in psychology and have continued to do that. And again, psychological perspectives are different. People are not thinking about necessarily the educational practices that are happening, but they're looking at things from the point of view of how the mind is working, or how an individual's conceptions are working, and how those are constructed, which is not quite the same as one was doing in education. So for me, subject interdisciplinarity is actually very, very important. So whenever I'm putting a research study together, I'm always thinking about the forms of interdisciplinarity that might be very, very useful, because I won't have all of those perspectives. I need other people's perspectives, and actually that will generate my thinking. So as a researcher, actually subject interdisciplinarity, in my view, is something that can generate your thinking, because you're getting feed from other sorts of perspectives. Methodological interdisciplinarity is a very complex one. Now, if, for example, we go back to that subject interdisciplinarity and we look down that list and we say, what are the research methodologies that people use in that list? Actually, what you find is that they're different. So if we were to start at the bottom, for example, a lot of the work in psychology is actually based upon quantitative research. And it's often based upon controlled research. Whereas that's not the case in something like education, where education can be based upon much more qualitative research or mixed methods research. And it's not the same as management, which will have a different perspective. So if we look at it from a methodological interdisciplinarity, we've also got to think about the ways in which those different research methods will integrate or overlap or work together, how they will complement each other without creating barriers. And the creation of barriers is possible because people can come from very specific disciplinary areas where methodological approaches are expected. And that expectation is something that often within interdisciplinarity one is having to face. You're having to face the fact that particular individuals within a team may very well be coming at it from a particular methodological approach. And you have to account for that. You have to accommodate that in some way and work out how things will work together rather than clash. So in methodological interdisciplinarity, I would say that those, for me, are the sorts of things that one often has to work with. You're faced with the idea of qualitative research as well as quantitative. Those are very different. Within qualitative, you're trying to understand the hows and whys, whereas within quantitative, you're exploring the extent that something is happening. That's not a why and a how, that's an extent. And statistical issues within methodological research are also particularly interesting because different disciplines have different ideas of how statistics work. So statistics are often linked to the idea of quantitative research, but actually statistics don't work in the same way, for example, in a biological subject as they do in an educational subject, because what you're looking at is completely different. Within a biological system, you're looking at something where your controls are much more approachable. You have a standardization which you don't have within education. It's very, very difficult actually to get controlled studies, even though some countries base a lot of their educational research on the idea of control-based studies. It's actually exceptionally difficult to do that unless you've got very, very large numbers involved. And once you have very large numbers involved, then you also have problems in terms of identifying exactly what is happening here. And the other problem there is you're often encountering the fact that with statistics, you're looking at averages, you're looking at means, you're looking at modal values, you're not actually looking at the extremities. And it's actually the extremities that are often the most interesting, rather than what's happening in terms of the average. I mean, we talked a bit about that over the last week or two in terms of inclusivity, where you're talking about these extremities rather than your averages. Those are the interesting areas often from an educational perspective. So there are lots of different methodological approaches, some of which come into different disciplines, and it's how those are brought together. The contextual interdisciplinarity, I think, is to do with, we work in a research context. Other people work in different contexts. They work either in a policy context or in a practice context. And for me, I'm interested in doing research in order to work with policy and practice. Yeah, I'm not necessarily interested in research from the point of view of research and researchers. I'm interested in research that will reach out to policymakers and practitioners. Now, for me, that's an interdisciplinarity, because the way in which I'm having to do the research and the way in which I'm having to think about the outcomes of that research are not necessarily to do with how researchers are going to read it. It's how policymakers and practitioners are going to read it. That's another form of interdisciplinarity. It's another layer, if you like. And then the cultural one is fascinating. You know, and having worked with people in different countries, we come with our own cultural backgrounds. And that means that we think in particular ways. So I worked in France for a while, and I realized that actually researchers in France had a much greater philosophical view of the world than I did as a researcher. So the way that they would think about it was actually very different from the way that I would think about it. Now that was a cultural form of interdisciplinarity. We were having to work through those ideas of how to communicate with each other so that we could understand each other and the approaches that we were taking, which is fascinating. But again, it's a form of interdisciplinarity, and it does mean that one's involved in doing that. So for me, there are those sort of 4 layers, if you like, of interdisciplinarity. Now, I don't know whether I should stop there and sort of open up the floor a bit before I go on to talk about examples or how you'd like me to take that. But I'm happy to sort of stop and open up some conversation at this point, if that would be an appropriate point to do that. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to take 3 examples, and all of these are current. Okay, so these are not past examples; these are all current. So, and I'm taking those because I think that the current context is actually forcing us in a way to think about interdisciplinarity to a greater extent. We are at a stage, I think, in research and in terms of developing knowledge and developing practice, where actually we're being asked to think about interdisciplinarity to greater and greater extents. And certainly what I'm seeing within the UK from our research councils is that you need to do that within any proposal that you're putting together where you're seeking national funding, that you have to think about an interdisciplinarity approach, because interdisciplinarity is seen as producing ideas and outcomes that are complementary, that are greater than a single discipline on its own. So all of these sort of levels that I've offered, if you like, are things that I think we're being encouraged increasingly to look at. And I don't think that actually we will turn back from that for quite a time. I think there will need to be a balance between the types of research that we do. But at the moment, there's a great demand for us to think about research that is of an interdisciplinary nature. And I think that there are good reasons for that. One of the things is that you can collect your ideas from different perspectives together at one time, rather than trying to do it at different times. So what's happened in the past is if you've gone along particular subject disciplines, you've had a particular discipline, let's say, at this point in time, that's been looking at it from an educational point of view, and then at this time from a psychological point of view, and then at this time from a management point of view, and it actually takes someone to link those together. And of course you can't link those together until somebody comes along later to do it. So you've got a delay in the whole process. So one of the reasons for thinking about interdisciplinarity is actually the time of outcomes of research and the use of that, which appears to be particularly important for some areas. And I would say that that's important for education. So I'm going to think about 3 examples here. The first is Head Start and Getting Ahead. Okay, Head Start and Getting Ahead are actually, they're not the names of research initiatives, they're examples of practice initiatives. And these practice initiatives are to do with schools and the development of mental health issues within children within schools, and how these can be addressed. So this is a UK initiative where a number of local authorities are developing practices to look at the ways in which mental health issues are handled within schools and how they can be handled more effectively so that young people can build resilience. So this one of the ways in which this project was described at an earlier stage was resilience. It's to do with the development of resilience. So this is a very, very interesting project, and it's a large project. It's working, I think, within 6 areas across the UK with quite a large number of schools. Now, I'm currently involved in that project, and I'm looking at it from an educational perspective. But as you can imagine, if you're looking at things from a mental health and resilience point of view, then you also need people who are looking at it from a different perspective. So there would be people there who are looking at it from a psychology perspective, and that psychology is not only to do with the psychology, if you like, of mental health, but it's also to do with the psychology of change. And there are people there who are looking at it from a management perspective, i.e. how can something like this be managed and then scaled up to a larger extent? And there are people that are looking at it from an economic perspective. So how does this work in terms of the economics? If you've got a project which is there, how can it be scaled up? Can it be scaled up? Does it make sense economically to do that? And how can you do it? So this is an example where there are different disciplines involved, looking at it from different perspectives. Now, the interesting thing is that those different perspectives are all coming together within the project. So as someone who's coming at it from a research point of view, I have to write it initially from a practitioner viewpoint or a policymaker viewpoint. So I'm not actually producing initially what you would call as a standard research report. I'm producing something which is a policy or a practitioner report, which is then accessible to people within the project. And actually the research report or the research paper or whatever comes at a later stage. So because of the interdisciplinary nature of it, actually the way in which I work from a researcher perspective needs to change, needs to accommodate the way in which that particular project is focused. So that would be one example. And then for the second example, I've got a toy over there which I must pick up. Okay, this second one is about the microbit. I don't know whether you've seen the microbit before, but this is basically a computer. This is actually designed for children. This is designed for children who are about 9 to 12 years of age, so that they can code this and use it. Yeah?
Yeah, it was popular. It went all over the UK, didn't it?
Yeah.
Sponsored by the BBC.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. This was in 2013. The UK government decided, or at least the Department for Education in England decided, that they would launch a computing curriculum, and that the computing curriculum would go across all schools from the age of 5 to 16. So they were introducing computing for 5-year-old children right through to 16 years of age. And that computing curriculum was concerned with coding and programming, but it was also concerned with creativity and computational thinking. So it was not just the idea of coding and programming that they wanted. They wanted children to be able to use computing for creative purposes and to develop computational thinking. So it was to be able to use computers so that you could do something with the coding, not just be able to program or code, but what were you going to do with it? What would be the outcome of it? How would it affect you or other people? How would it affect your understanding? How would it affect what you could do? Would it make things better for anybody? Would it provide anything which was interesting? Okay, so the BBC put together a partnership which developed this, which is called the microbit. And this is basically, in essence, like a sort of a motherboard. Yeah. So what you have is you have the ability to be able to code this and to link it. So this has Bluetooth and Wi-Fi capability. It can be coded online. It can be coded also from a keyboard. It doesn't. So it's very versatile. It can be linked to a whole range of sensors, etc. So the idea that they had, these sorts of devices already existed. So Raspberry Pi or Arduino would be examples of ones that already existed. But what they wanted to do was they wanted to make something which was more powerful and which was more versatile. So it could be coded in a wide range of languages rather than a single one or two. And also it would be able to be linked to a very, very large number of other devices. So it was much more universal. That was their aim. And this device went out to about 750,000 pupils in schools in the UK. And it's also gone out to pupils in other countries. So it's gone out to pupils in Iceland and in Croatia and in Singapore, for example. Now, this is interesting because actually I've just agreed with Microbit Educational Foundation to undertake some research on this, where we're looking at educational outcomes. Now, my interest, of course, in this is how is it being used for creativity and for computational thinking, because the coding, in essence, is not so difficult. You know, it's possible to code things by using a piece of coding that you've already got and copying that, etc. I'm more interested in how it's being used. Now, what the Microbit Educational Foundation have already found is that it is being used for some really quite creative purposes. So in one school, a number of pupils coded this so that it could be linked to temperature and altitude sensors that would then be linked to a helium balloon that would be released. And I think the balloon went up 23 kilometers. And of course, all of the data from were brought back. So they could see not only the altitude, but the temperature differences as it was going up. And I think on the day that this happened, they also had to divert aircraft around to make sure that they didn't collide with the helium balloon. I don't know how true that is, but that's what I'm told. So this is an example of, this is a really interesting example because from an educational perspective, I can look at this from an educational perspective, but I can't necessarily look at this from other perspectives. So I'm interested in this from a computing perspective as well. So I my first initial thought was how do I work with other people in order to bring in different perspectives on this, and how is it possible to then work further on this? So I'm showing this as an example because for me it's one which is very recent, but it's highlighted for me the need to think about interdisciplinarity and the way that I would think about researching this with other people, and what other perspectives I would need to be able to build a picture for not only for the Microbit Educational Foundation, but basically for practitioners and policymakers, because this is what comes out of that initiative, and it's a very large initiative, should clearly be of interest to policymakers and practitioners. It should be of interest. You know, the examples that one can gather from across that use should be able to be accessible to other practitioners so that they can start to think about the ways that these sorts of devices are being used. But they also need to think about what that means in terms of the computing practices as well as the educational practices. So that's why I need to think about this from an interdisciplinary perspective. Okay, so that's a second example, and then the third example is even more recent, and actually that's been something that's arisen because of my experiences here. Okay, so whilst I've been here, I've had a wonderful experience here, but also I've been able to think about the sorts of things that are happening here, which are to some extent quite different from the sorts of things that I would be thinking about within the UK. But I can perhaps draw on my experiences and background coming from the UK to think about exploring things from what's happening here. One of the areas that I've looked at in the past is to do with the ways that education leads to employment or not. So I'm interested in this idea of why people find it difficult to learn, but I'm also interested then in what that means in terms of future engagement with education, training and employment. So I've looked in the past at what in the UK we call NEET. And this group of people, who are called NEET, are those who are not in education, employment or training. So I've looked at reasons for that, the reasons why people are not in that, and I've looked at ideas of how they might be supported in terms of engaging more with education, training and employment. And coming here to the Philippines, you know, I'm aware of challenges here that to some extent we don't have in the UK. So, for example, I'm well aware of this idea of rural migration, which to an extent is different in the UK, but it's still there. So, in the UK, what happens is that we have our schools are distributed pretty evenly across urban and rural areas. So, children gain, because of a national curriculum, they gain a sort of similar education, if you like, across the piece. And then they go into, from primary, they go into secondary schools. And the secondary schools are also distributed. But they tend to be in larger towns or cities. So what you get is you get, therefore, for their education, you get a migration towards urban environments when they move from primary to secondary school. And in fact, in a sense, they're becoming more used to that urban form of environment because they're going to a larger school. Yeah? So in essence, you almost get this idea that they're moving from often a small, quite compact primary school to a larger, more, what you might call more urbanized secondary school. And then, of course, when they move on to further education and training, they don't go back to a rural area. They move further on into university or college, which tend again to be more urban, or training, which tends to be urban. So we get that pattern, but it, as I understand it, the pattern, and I've looked at some of the statistics in the Philippines, although some of them are quite difficult to understand, but I've looked at what I can. And from what I can see, you have similar patterns, but the extent of migration is often quite large. From the data that I've seen, it can be quite large. So again, you have that interesting shift from rural to urban. And one of the things about that is, why is that happening, and does the reverse happen? In other words, do people go back to rural areas, or do they not? And if they don't, why not? You know, why don't they go back to rural areas? Does that mean that the education that they're getting within an urban area suits the urban area, and therefore they are educated and trained for an urban environment and no longer for a rural environment? Or does it mean that the education and training that they're getting in an urban environment is not actually equipping them to think about how they can use particular skills for employment within a rural area? So why is all of this happening? Why are we continuing to get this move, this rural migration? So having seen that here and having thought about what I've been looking at, I wondered, I've had some discussions with Dean Baggy on this, and because of the sorts of things that you're doing and thinking about as well, which seem to me to fit in really well with those sorts of ideas and the sort of background that I've had, and is this idea of if those sorts of things are true, if those questions, hypotheses, if you like, that I'm putting forward are true, then is there something that we should be thinking about in terms of what we might call rural empowerment? And one of the things that came up from my previous research was that often training for young people tends to focus upon an understanding of particular context, a deep understanding of context. So when they go into training, they understand that context very, very deeply. So if they're going, for example, into the automobile industry, the training means that they have a deep understanding of the automobile industry. It doesn't mean that they have any knowledge at all of carpet manufacturing. Okay? It's the automobile industry that they have that understanding of. So that's one thing. The second thing is that the uses of technologies tend to be thought about in urban areas and not so much in rural areas. And yet, there are actually some really good examples of how technologies are being used to support employment in rural areas. And then the third is, often people, if they're in rural areas, have to think in very sort of entrepreneurial ways. So actually, I was at Costrales, which is really, really interesting. And I met the owner there, and she was briefly telling me about what they're doing and how they're setting up, etc. But that's a really good example, I felt, of something that's happening in a rural context where they've clearly thought about what they're doing, and from not only from what they can do in terms of deep understanding of their rural context and what they can do, but also from an entrepreneurial point of view, what is it that they can make and achieve there? So this is the third one, if you like, where at the moment we're sort of toying with ideas of how we might explore this one, and it's a question of yes, this is likely to be something where there's certainly going to be a need for interdisciplinary thinking and involvement, and I think that this is one that I certainly have an interest in this, and it seems to me that it's something that could be explored and developed further. And I think this is something that would be of interest, within the UK. It would be of interest in other areas as well. So I'm giving that as a very, very current example. In other words, I'm trying to show you how you've influenced my thinking while I've been here, but also influenced my thinking with regard to concepts of interdisciplinarity and the need, my recognition of the need to think of this sort of emerging area of thinking as being something where interdisciplinary thinking needs to be brought in. So I hope I've given 3 examples. I've given 3 examples. I hope those are okay. Yeah. So maybe I should stop at that point and open it up again.
Thank you for that, Dr. Pese. Now, I'm very interested in the Head Start and Getting Ahead project. Now, as you said, is about mental health, people with mental health. Now, I'm sure you've heard of GRIT, which is a study. I think Angela Duckworth was very famous about it in her TED Talk about GRIT. Now, would you think that it would be a good study to correlate GRIT with the resilience of people who have mental health issues? So we study GRIT and we can apply that in how, because students who have mental health issues find it very difficult to complete tasks, to finish their studies. And with GRIT, maybe we can study, maybe we can find out how we can help these students to actually achieve academic success and finish their studies.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for the question, and yes, I mean, I think that any mechanism that's possible that will support that form of resilience and focus and finishing is really important. I mean, the what's coming out of this project so far, and there is a single report on this that's now it's about to be released, is that the experiences of schools with young people, and I'm talking here about young people who are in the 10 to 13 years of age. So the idea of this particular project was to try to pick up on the emergence of mental health issues in order to try to identify things from a fairly early stage, in order to try to address those at an early stage. So this particular project is focused in age at the moment. What I think what is coming out of this is that there are a whole range of different sorts of mental health issues that are arising. So some of those mental health issues arise because of concerns, for example, arising from the home situation. Others arise from the school situation. Others arise from a very different sort of situation, which is actually not related either to home or school, but is related to the individual and the way that they are thinking and able to think about things. So what we've got is a very, very wide range of mental health issues that are there. And it's a question of how one can try to address those. The way that the Getting Ahead program is looking at this is to think about this in terms of trying to build a whole range of personal characteristics. Things like perseverance, endeavour, self-determination, self-confidence, etc. So they've put a program together which actually runs across, I think it runs across something like 4 to 5 months, where they're actually taken out of school, not for the whole of that time, but for periods of time, where, for example, they go on a 5-day residential, and there are a whole series of activities that are there in order to build those characteristics. So they're there with counsellors and mentors who are working with them. And at the moment, what the findings are that is actually having benefits and effects. So the program that they've put together is very specific for this age range, and it's very specific for the particular context of these children. All of the children that I'm looking at within this program are, again, within urban areas. And actually a lot of the experiences that are given to them are actually within rural areas. Yeah, so they're taken out on residentials which are in sort of outward bound type of experiences. So this is already having effect. So the program that they've put together is having effect. They've looked at that in terms of what's coming out from both the pupils' perspectives and the teachers' perspectives, and at the moment the findings from that are quite strong. But yes, building those sorts of characteristics, I think, is really, really important. For me, it's identifying what the characteristics are, and then how you build that. And from my perspective, from this sort of interdisciplinary perspective, I can identify those features and factors. What I can't do is build the program. Yeah, I can look at what might be coming out of that, but I can't look at it from a mental health perspective, right? So I can be involved in a part of that. I can feed from and feed into, but from a researcher point of view, I cannot take the whole responsibility for all of that. I can be involved in that at particular levels and in particular ways. So from an interdisciplinary point of view, the important thing from me as a researcher is to understand what I can do and what I can't do, and what it is that I need other people to do. What is it that I need those people to do? And in essence, I need people to understand, if you like, that they can use my findings and put that into practice. But I may need to help them to show them how, but I can't produce the practice. Yeah, I can't produce that program. I'm not going to be there as the counselors. I'm not going to be there as the mentors. That's not my role. And similarly, I'm not going to look at it from a mental health perspective, because I don't have a psychiatry background. Yeah, that's not a part of my background. So it's important to work with people. But I entirely agree with you that I think picking up on those features and characteristics and finding ways to build those is really, really important.
Thank you so much. Also, I have an additional question, if you don't mind. In Denmark, students get paid to actually go to university. I don't know if you know about this, but they essentially get paid. They have money every month to pay for rent and food and travel expenses, while in the UK, you spend thousands of dollars to get to university. Now, the only downside about Denmark is that working people or people who are working actually pay 35% for their taxes, while in the UK, I think it's just 15-20%. And now, what do you think about the research that can be done about this to create policy, and would it be good? Would you agree with Denmark, or would you agree with the UK?
Wow. Okay. Thanks for that question. That's very much. That's very much a sort of a policy perspective, I think. The backgrounds are different. So the ways in which people think in Denmark is not necessarily the ways in which people think in the UK, and I wouldn't like to sort of go too far along that line. Maybe the UK, when I went to university originally as an undergrad, I did not pay to go to university. And indeed, I was given an allowance per term. So actually the same sort of situation did exist in the UK as now exists in Denmark, but that is no longer the case. What has happened is that those funds that were made available for me have slowly been removed, shifted in ways over time. So when my children went to university, I paid fees for them to go to university. And therefore there was a demand upon me as a parent to be able to provide for that. Now that was a shift and change in terms of policy over time, and that's been argued on the basis of economics. As far as I can see, that's never really been argued on the basis of education or learning. It's been based on economics. And you can consider that from a number of perspectives. So from an economic perspective, what the UK have done is appropriate from an economic perspective. If you look at it from a social perspective, you might then argue with it and say that's not the appropriate thing to do. What we should be doing is be providing for free education. So I think to some extent it depends upon where your perspective lies and how you want to argue that. One of the things that's happened, as you say, in Denmark is that people are tending to pay more in terms of tax. Actually, in the UK, we do pay probably a bit more than you've indicated, because what we have is bands. So we have tax bands depending upon extents of earnings, and you come into different sort of tax bands. So the more you earn, the more you get taxed, basically. So that happens, and I honestly don't know what the average is. I could find it out, but I don't know at the moment what the average is. But clearly the economics that have been involved, that's been one way of looking at that. Whereas Denmark has tended, I think, to take a more social perspective on it, and has attempted therefore to retain that. But then the economics have to work in a different way, because if you do go along that line, then something else has to give. And I think it's a matter of which lines different countries have taken on this. You know, if you look at the US, for example, you know, the situation there is particular with regard to funding for universities, colleges, etc. Whereas if you look at other countries, I was fairly recently in India, and you've got a very different system there, depending upon the type of university or the type of college that's involved, etc. So you know, you've got different sorts of economics and different sorts of social perspectives on this, and I think it's the balance of those. So I don't know whether I would argue for one or the other. What I would say is it's possible to argue it from different perspectives, and I'm here. My perspective is on education. I'm interested in how we can best educate everyone who can fulfill their potential and gain in times of life engagement. So that's my interest. That would be my focus. And you know, if we can achieve that, with different models, I'm quite happy from an educational point of view. If we're not achieving that through different models, then from an educational perspective, I would have an argument one way or the other.
Thank you for sharing your experience, Dr. Pasi. I regret that I wasn't able to hear all because of we're preparing for the National. But my question is about your experience with the interdisciplinary team. Because we come from different worldviews and perspectives, so I'd like to ask you, how do you handle it? How is collegiality maintained in an interdisciplinary research? Okay,
thank you for that question. I mean, and I guess that I'd probably answer it in terms of sort of almost two extremes, if you like. I think sometimes it's actually not possible to get collegiality. You know, I cannot pretend that everyone that I've looked to work with has been someone that I have worked with, because you sometimes do find experiences where, for whatever reasons, you're not able to work with someone else. What I have found important is that there's time to explore that. I've been in situations where actually it's almost been, partners in research have almost been thrust upon me. I've not known them. I've just ended up with a whole group of people that I need to work with, and I don't know them, and I find that a bit scary. Because actually I don't think that's the best starting point, because you don't know how that's going to work out. And I do know that there have, you know, I'm aware of some European projects, for example. I mean, the EU has engaged researchers from across the EU for a very long time in terms of research projects, bringing people from different countries and disciplines together. And, you know, there are stories that come out of that, of groups that have just not been able to get on together, and the whole thing has been a disaster because it's just fallen apart. And for me, what's really important is to spend the time being able to engage with people initially and talk to people and find ways forward of working, so that one has an understanding as best one can. But I do think it's really important. I mean, I hope that the way I approach things is an accommodating way. I'm not trying to give my perspective and my belief that perspective is all prevailing. I don't believe that is the way forward for me. I'm interested in what other people can bring, and in those different levels, what is it? So that discussion that I'm having, I'm interested in finding out what people are thinking and why they're thinking that, and what they can bring. And for me, that's a really important and interesting part of it. I have an interest in finding out about what all of you have to say to me. And I'm here to listen as much as I'm here to talk. And that, for me, that's really, really important, that I'm in a learning experience. I'm not here in a teaching experience. I'm here in a learning experience. And I know that I've learned a lot already from being here, and I hope that that part of that is being able to listen to people and what they're saying. So I think we have to try and work in an accommodating way, and listen to each other and understand what we're saying and how we can work together on things, rather than trying to provide some sort of platform that we then think other people will fit into. That's not how it works. You're into negotiation, if you like. You're into this idea of what each can bring and how you fit all of that together. It's a bit like it's a bit like a jigsaw puzzle, where actually you're creating the pieces as you go along, rather than having them to start with. You don't know what the size of the pieces are or what the shape of them are, but you've got lots of pieces. And it's a matter of trying to make the shapes as you go along so that they can fit together. And that's the way that I see that sort of working with interdisciplinarity.
Can I follow up in terms of authorship in an interdisciplinary research? So how do you deal with authorship? Though the billing is not so important, but it's an issue that we face when we are in an interdisciplinary work, when we present the report, when we publish the report. So what would be the guideline in terms of claiming authorship?
Okay. Thank you. Okay, that I think is a really interesting question. And I work with many doctoral students who are doing their own research, and sometimes they will come to me and they will say, would you be interested in working with me on a joint paper? And my answer to this is yes, but actually you've already done this work and you could write it as a paper yourself. You don't need me to write it. You can do this. If you want me to read it and give you comment on it, I will do that. But this is your work, and if you're able to produce this and publish it. If, on the other hand, you want me to put in anything intellectually into the paper, if you think that I can add something intellectually, if that's what you're asking me to do, then I'm happy to do that, and I'm happy for that to be a joint paper. But as you have done all of this work, I'm basically adding into this, and therefore I would be a second author. Because this is your work. If I can add, fine. You would need to see what I can add and agree to that, but I'm happy then to be a second author. If, on the other hand, you want me to produce a draft paper that from my work where you think it intersects with your work, if what you're wanting here is for me to produce that draft so that then you can put the work from your research into that paper, then that's more like me as a first author and you as a second author. I said, but there are also other possibilities, which is that it's joint authorship, and that is where you have equal contribution. So under those circumstances, we would normally go for sort of alphabetical order of authors, but each would have equal status. So, and the way in which that's recognized is when we record our research at a university level, we have to indicate if there are multiple authors, 2 or more authors, we have to indicate what the contribution of each author has been. And then we're able to indicate whether it's a lead and a second author or a joint author, etc. So that's the way. But I think for me it is to do with that sort of approach. That's how I've taken it forward. And I mean, I have worked, for example, in the latter half of last year, I was working with a group of about 6 or 7 people, and we put a paper together which was joint authored. So there was contribution from 7 people, and you then have to work out whether there is a lead author, whether it's a fully joint author. But again, it's something I think that's there for discussion, and that's always something that I would discuss, and that's the sort of way that I would open up the discussion on that.
If I can respond to that, I worked on a really messy collaboration last year. And we had 6 authors. The first 4 were equal contribution authors, and then the last 2 were not because they didn't put in any work. But I know of other people whose strategy would be to, at the very end, in the acknowledgement section, you state what each author has done. So that's kind of another way of doing it. And then in some fields, like in the sciences where you have a laboratory, the last author is important. I didn't know this until about a couple of years ago. So first and last authors are the only ones that matter. Everyone else in the middle, it doesn't matter, and it becomes really problematic. I don't know. I'm still looking for the solution to that as well.
Hi, yes, good morning. Since we are in the academe, we couldn't escape the paradigm debates. And you mentioned that in terms of interdisciplinarity of research, methodologically, it's also very important. How do you manage the different paradigms if you have many researchers working together? And of course, how do you divide your resources?
Okay. Thanks for that question. And I think that's probably, I think it's a really important question. I think I'm lucky because I'm actually a mixed methods researcher. So I'm lucky in the sense that because I'm mixed methods, I can see the reasoning and the purpose for quantitative. I can see the reasoning and purpose for qualitative. I can see the reasoning and purpose for mixing those two in various ways. And I mean, actually, the researcher that I've most followed in that respect is probably Creswell. I don't know whether you know Creswell's work, but he's a researcher from the States. His writing is incredibly good, but most of his life he's devoted to the idea of mixed methods research, and he's developed a whole series of thinking about that, and has produced a series of books that have indicated how his thinking has developed as he's worked through these different paradigms. And one of the things that I find really important and I find really interesting with his work is how he sees different ways of mixing. So it's not just a matter of quantitative and qualitative. It's a matter of what particular forms of quantitative, what particular forms of qualitative, and how you sequence those. So do you sequence them in a linear order, or do you sequence them concurrently, or do you group them, etc. So what he's come out with is a sort of a topology of ways of thinking about the mixing of methods. But he also has brought out, I think, ideas of conceptualizing mixed methods. So this idea, for example, if we think about sort of epistemological or ontological approaches, i.e. the ways we think about knowledge and how we're going to apply them, you know, the sort of traditional way of thinking about quantitative research is that people have a positivistic approach to the world, i.e. that because of the quantitative data and the ways that those quantitative data are giving you outcomes, you're thinking about it in terms of being positivist. In other words, it tends to be towards a black and a white. It's this or it's that. That's the traditional way of thinking about that. What he's done, and others as well, like Johnson and Onzagubi, is to think about this idea of pragmatism, where actually you're not necessarily thinking about it either from a positivistic approach or from a totally subjective approach, but you're thinking about it from a pragmatic approach, i.e. what do you want to do with your research and methodology for the particular research study that you're doing? Yeah? So for me, being a mixed methods researcher, I'm also lucky in that I can understand how someone can take a positivistic approach. I can also understand how they can take a pragmatic approach, because in some studies I've done those things. So for some studies I have taken a positivistic approach, and for others I've taken a pragmatist approach. Now, because of that, I'm probably lucky, because I believe I can think in ways that others are thinking, and therefore I can try and draw that together in some ways. So my ways of working, if you like, are to try to understand where individuals come from in terms of their methodological approach, but also their epistemological and ontological thinking, and then to think about how I can put that together, again, in using this idea of the jigsaw puzzle. Yeah? How do I piece it so that everyone feels that they can take their approach, but that it fits with the approach of others? So I'm quite happy that a psychologist can take a positivistic approach. And I'm quite happy that a qualitative educational researcher, yeah, can take an entirely subjective approach, because I can then indicate to them how the value of each of those contributes. So what I'm emphasizing is the value they are bringing. I'm not trying to argue one way or the other. I'm arguing for the value of what they're bringing. So I'm seeing it in terms of their contribution and the ways that their approaches are contributing. So that would be my sort of way of approach of how to think about that. Yeah.